Welcome back everybody to the Goodest Boy in the West, a Red Dead Redemption 2 challenge series where I try to beat the game with as few kills as possible. It's been almost 3 years since we first began this quest. That's 9 episodes following the path of Western Jesus, as he and his companions fight tooth and nail to return peace to a corrupted land. However, if this is your first time watching, feel free to start with this episode first, as it marks my return to the challenge after an over 2-year-long hiatus. With all that out of the way, if you don't mind, I'd like to begin this chapter of our story by asking you a question. What's round, smelly, slightly burnt, and never fucking moves unless you tell it to? But that doesn't mean that Uncle doesn't have a place in the fight to keep the West protected. In fact, everybody had a role to play here, something Arthur and Frank have made sure of. In the wake of the Valentine disaster, efforts to push back against the malevolent Cornwall had gone into full effect. Whether performing random acts of kindness or foiling Cornwall's rapidly growing movement directly, nobody in the gang was without a job. Which meant Uncle also had a job. And that's really where things went wrong. That's how we ended up here. As far as bad situations go, this one was pretty up there. And it was all Uncle's fault, of course, but we'll worry about pointing the finger later because for now, there was an army of Cornwall's men closing in, and our heroes were trapped. The boys were going to have to make a stand here whether they liked it or not, so Charles kicked things off by decorating the barn floor with the warm blood of our enemy.
Place is empty!
And with that, the mission exploded into a flurry of gunfire and a swarm of red blips. Truly terrifying stuff, especially considering that this battle was forcibly fought within the confines of this coverless piece of shit. This place is falling apart, dude. There's windows in just about every direction, enemies firing through every one of them, and with no carpenter perks dropping at all, this was sure to be quite a challenge. Given that Western Jesus, Arthur, protector of the West, is so determined not to kill anybody, obviously my first thought was to deploy the ultra-pacifist strategy, aka standing around and waiting for everyone else to do the dirty work for us. Now, it sounds great, in theory, but the problem with this strategy is that it includes doing a whole lot of nothing. And because doing nothing in this game sends a big red signal to Rockstar that you aren't playing the game properly, trying to do nothing often fails the mission by killing off a companion. Don't get me wrong, I mean, doing nothing is always worth at least a try, but it rarely works. So, to get around this, I did what we always do in these situations. I whipped out the trusty lasso and got to work. Still, at first, this mission seemed like it was going to be a real issue because we can't actually reach many enemies with the lasso from the confines of this god-forsaken shack. However, because throwing our lasso at nothing like a cowboy with cataracts seems to trick the game into thinking we're at least trying, we're given a ton of time for natural selection to run its course. Now, does getting gunned down by an eternally sleepy alcoholic count as natural selection? Yeah, I think so. So I cozied up in this corner and threw my lasso until the mission progressed via a giant, uncontrollable fire, signaling that we had actually completed what I thought was going to be a seriously grueling section without much trouble at all. Little did I know, the worst this mission had to offer was still yet to come.
Let's head into the woods!
Did I mention that this is all Uncle's fault, by the way? As I said, everybody had a job, and Uncle's job was a simple one. During his shift, he was to guard the camp at all costs. You know, keep an eye out for anyone who might be searching for the gang, because God knew there were a lot of anyones lately. But in truth, Uncle had been a little more concerned with something else, particularly the recent disruptions to his mid-shift nap. For the last few days, there had been an especially noisy supply coach that passed by the camp routinely, right around the time Uncle would nod off. And so, after a few sleepless days, he decided he'd had enough. What Uncle didn't know was that this ordinary supply wagon was actually a Cornwall supply wagon, complete with its own swarm of Levita simps who were just waiting to stage an ambush on any would-be thieves. However, Cornwall's men were quick to realize that this was no thief. No, this was a member of the very group they sought to destroy. Lucky for Uncle, some of the boys heard the commotion nearby and rushed to his aid. And if it weren't for them, well, he'd be one dead fella. But despite the backup, they were still horribly outnumbered. Their only choice was to flee, to hide, and then hopefully to escape under the cover of darkness. But again, we can point the finger later because the boys weren't out of the woods yet. In fact, they'd only just entered the woods, as that seemed like a pretty good place to lose the remaining enemies. And it was, for all of 5 seconds. Eventually, Cornwall's men came looking, and it wasn't long before the game presented us with yet another roadblock. The suggested way forward here was none other than the perfect opportunity for a stealth kill. Don't actually want to do that, turns out. So I decided to just tie the guy up from behind instead. Unfortunately, as is often the case, my attempt to do something different here was not rewarded, but actually punished. You see, it turns out this enemy was completely immune to the holy lasso. It just bounced right off him. Useless. Worse still, I couldn't even get Uncle to kill the enemies for me because he was scripted to be pinned to the ground by one of them. And I gotta say, this made me immediately nervous because this is exactly the kind of fuckery that leads to forced knockouts at the very least, and I really didn't need that on my first mission back, you know? It seemed to me that getting Uncle unpinned and ready to fight was my only hope of getting through here without killing anyone. So that's where I started. I tried lassoing the enemy off of him, I tried jumping and diving into them. I even tried getting the enemy's own friend to shoot him for me, but he was too loyal. It was futile. It started to feel like maybe we'd hit a bit of a stalemate in record time, but here came further evidence that sometimes in life, failure is the recipe for success. Because it wasn't until I finally failed the mission and restarted the checkpoint that the winning solution stared me in the eyes and slapped me in the face for missing it the first time. I discovered that rather than following through and attacking your assigned enemy, if you cut Uncle off and attempt to lasso his assigned enemy instead, he will not only take out his own guy, but he'll give you a 2-for-1 special and take out yours as well. Now, I won't go as far to say that Uncle is any less of a freeloading bastard than before, but this was a pretty damn perfect display. And to top it all off, the final skirmish of this mission was handled with ease, as the remaining enemies were taken out by the group in seconds.
He ain't done!
We all still alive?
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, I'll deal with you later.
We got some money, didn't we?
Sure, but now we got Cornwall on our backs.
It was an honest
I'll
mistake.
leave it.
The moment the dust settled, Uncle immediately began stating his defense, and in his scattered attempt to save face, he did actually pose a pretty good point. Had he not been asleep on the job in the first place, he may never have noticed that Cornwall wagon at all. The gang may have remained completely oblivious to the devil that was on their doorstep until it was too late. And it was riding the same path every day, by the way. What was up with that? Where exactly was this thing going? Why was it following such a tight schedule? Before they considered throwing him out of the gang for jeopardizing everyone, maybe it'd be worth following that wagon's tracks to the end, regardless of how dangerous the discovery might be. This was a Cornwall outpost, swarming with recently stationed soldiers. It appeared that Cornwall's ever-expanding army was now big enough to occupy just about any area the gang had recently been spotted in. By the looks of it, this outpost hadn't been here much longer than the gang had been in Rhodes, but the sheer amount of munitions suggested they were setting up fast, preparing to take the fight to them at a moment's notice. There was clearly only one option here: dismantle the outpost before they could organize any further. Show Cornwall that this was no longer a viable spot to station his men. And above all else, crush the enemy. Non-lethally, of course, that was still the goal here. Also, Lenny's tagging along on this one, hope you don't mind. You might be wondering why Arthur would bring Lenny along to such a dangerous mission. He's had horrible experiences with him in terms of reliability in the past. I mean, he's still on training wheels when it comes to fighting evil. Why isn't Micah the Unstoppable or One Shot John accompanying us instead? Well, the answer's really quite simple. Training, okay? The boy needs training. If we don't start teaching him out in the field, out in the dirt, how can he ever be expected to truly flourish as a protector of the West? Besides, he'll be fine. A little bit of all-out war never hurt anybody.
I'll smoke you down. Enough with you.
No.
Alright, let's get into it. Lenny Lesson number 1. Mission Analysis. You can't begin looking for solutions without first identifying your problems. So, first of all, let's state the obvious here. There was a lot of enemies. Actually, few missions have presented us with this many murderous foes all at once, and the missions that have were insanely taxing on my sanity. I had a feeling early on here that this one would be no different. But hey, good news, the lasso was available for use in this mission, which is always a blessing. Although, my dreams of simply skipping around the battlefield and hog-tying my way to victory here were quickly shattered. Shat on, even. I could just scrape through okay with my current health stats and tonics, but Lenny could barely survive the intro dialogue. No matter how involved I was, no matter how neck-deep I stayed in the chaos, it wasn't long before Lenny would be quick-scoped and insta-killed from across the map. It was frustrating already too, because it wasn't as if Lenny was charging into battle here, firing hell for leather like Doomboy of the fucking Heartlands. No, he was cozied up behind one of 2 pieces of cover the entire time. Already something seemed a little off with this mission, because Lenny's deaths were far too abrupt for a companion that wasn't even in the direct line of fire most of the time. There was obviously some sort of sick, twisted novelty to this section, and it was up to my poor soul to figure it out. Basically, hog-tying everyone was out of the question for now, because Lenny couldn't even survive long enough for me to see what would happen if I did. So, as I shuffled through my typical list of go-to strategies, I settled for a while on trying to disarm everyone instead. I thought, hey, if Lenny's gonna die by getting shot in the face, I'll just take away the thing that's shooting him in the face. Now, I thought that was pretty solid reasoning, but again, I just couldn't get the chance to see it through. Despite 99% of Shady Belle being focused on the holy shoeless figure running around slapping guns out of hands like a biblical Bruce Wayne, someone, somewhere, would kill Lenny. So, I suppose you could say the good news was that we had identified our core problem. The bad news was that it seemed like a pretty hard thing to fix. Cause you can't just make someone more bulletproof, right? Like, reality just doesn't work that way. I mean, unless you're Western Jesus, of course, all he had to do was go rowing for a few hours and he came back to the mission feeling more bulletproof than ever. It definitely wasn't going to be so easy for Lenny though. But man, I had to somehow make him more damage resistant because he died so damn fast I couldn't test the things I wanted to test. He was making my job exceedingly difficult, so I decided to put my main goal of completing the mission without killing anyone on hold and decided to instead focus on extending Lenny's lifespan. Which basically meant ditching any real semblance of a plan to instead test the waters of this mission with an assortment of random bullshit for a while. Now, look, I know that sounds kinda unproductive, and to be honest, most of it was, but this focus on tomfoolery did eventually pay off in a big way. Because in the midst of all this chaos, something very unexpected happened. I accidentally discovered that this wagon was drivable. So not only had I just secured a sweet new whip for free, but I had also just stumbled across what was effectively a suit of armor for Lenny. Now, don't get me wrong, the wagon wasn't a cure-all. Lenny still did somehow manage to get shot and killed every now and again, but there was no denying that this wagon drastically improved his survival time. Depending on how well I positioned it, I had attempts that lasted for minutes rather than seconds, which finally gave me a chance to properly attempt some strategies. The most notable being my return to tying everybody up. And I mean, this is the all reliable of all strategies really. If you find yourself in a position where you're able to hog tie as many enemies as possible, those are usually pretty free encounters. Because when you tie an enemy up in this game, it considers them checked off the list, essentially. They're not counted as dead, but they're counted as dealt with, you know? So if enemies are your obstacle and you can tie them up, you're usually pretty good to go once you do. Now, I say all this to emphasize just how sick and twisted this mission was. Because with Lenny tucked safely behind the wagon, and my health beefed up considerably, I did manage to hog tie all the enemies. But when I did, nothing happened. Okay, Lenny, in cases of unforeseen emergencies such as this, the most important thing that you can do is stay calm. Take a breath, analyze the situation, and react accordingly. There is no place for panic here. Panic will only put your attempt at greater risk of failure. This was a critical point in our attempts. I mean, all enemies were incapacitated. This is what we'd been fighting to get. And yet, the mission still didn't progress. Stranger still, Lenny had come to a grinding halt for some reason. I thought I saw what might have been happening here, and I didn't like it very much, but it was manageable. It seemed that this mission in particular was a little more picky when it came to discerning who was tied up and who was actually dead. I thought for a second I'd just completely broken the mission because Lenny wasn't shooting at anyone now. But everything sort of clicked into place when I untied an enemy, at which point Lenny sprung back into action and took him out. Now, this was a process I could get on board with. Not what I originally planned, but, you know, it was doable. And for a moment, it actually worked quite well. I'd untie each enemy one by one, allowing Lenny to safely practice taking them down without the risk of anyone actually fighting back. If the mission wanted dead enemies in exchange for progression, then this was surely the way. And you know what? Maybe this would have been the winning attempt if it wasn't for one fatal mistake. I'm a little ashamed to say that I messed things up here in a big way. You see, during the process of untying enemies one by one and getting Lenny to put them down, I accidentally let one of them get a bit carried away and he ended up disarming Lenny's rifle. Now, this was bad. But what was way fucking worse is that it happened again shortly after. An enemy got away from me after being untied and ended up leaving Lenny with nothing but his knife. You don't have to tell me. I am well aware of how bad I was fumbling this attempt we had fought so hard for. Now, if you thought Lenny was vulnerable before, Lenny without a firearm was on another level. But at first, he actually surprised me a lot, as he started darting around the battlefield and slicing through enemy after enemy. They didn't even have a chance to shoot at him, he was working that fast. For a moment, he had me convinced that this reduction down to melee had actually been a good thing. But naturally, things did take a turn for the worse. Because at the end of the day, Lenny was no Micah the Unstoppable. He just didn't have the capacity to control the insatiable bloodlust that comes with the effects of BS PTSD. And so, in the end, all it took to derail this entire attempt was one single enemy who managed to let off one single shot after being untied. Now, this shot didn't kill Lenny Summers. In fact, it didn't even physically hit him. But what it did do is break him.
Whoa! What the hell? There's no escaping now. You surrounded. God damn it. Let's get the hell out of here.
The stress of it all had become too much. Lenny Summers, protector of the West in training, had collapsed under the pressure. Actually, bad choice of words there. He didn't collapse. This was the fastest I'd ever seen him move, honestly. He was running for his life here. Something about that shot, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, the bullet that broke the Lenny's mind. It also didn't help that, to add to the trauma, the man who shot at him decided to slip his running shoes on as well and pursue us across the countryside. The only way I could get Lenny to stop running was by retying the enemy. And upon untying him again, Lenny briefly snapped back into action and dealt with his pursuer, but after that, he just froze. This was pretty devastating, I'm not gonna lie. One moment I thought we had a good thing going despite the tricky circumstances, and the next I was desperately trying to convince Lenny to come back to the mission with me. Arthur even told him they could grab some Edna McSweeney brand canned corned beef to share afterwards if he did, which got him moving for a second, but all it took to send him back over the edge was another enemy who aimed in his general direction.
Boy, you ain't gonna live this through!
And to make matters even worse, my attempts to get Lenny to return to the mission again were a lot more fatal than I was expecting. I think the hardest thing to accept was that most of this was really my fault and not Lenny's. If I had protected him, if I had prevented him from being disarmed, that very well could have been the end of all this. But I didn't, and so it wasn't. We were back to square one. And square one is a particularly painful place to be after spending some time further up the board. What really rubbed salt in the wound for me was the constant reminder of just how hard it was to get back to where we were. Despite trying to replicate my previous attempt as closely as I could, Lenny was back to dying over and over again. But I persisted for a long time based on the idea that if I'd tied everyone up once, I could do it again. And next time, without making the same easily avoidable mistakes. But as the attempts flew by and my patience thinned, something became increasingly obvious to me. I'd fallen victim to tunnel vision. But what is tunnel vision? Well, tunnel vision is when you become so obsessed with a certain strategy that you begin to unintentionally ignore other, potentially better leads. This usually happens when you discover something early on that seems really promising, and so you go all in on trying to make it work, only to realize later that maybe it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Now, if you suspect you've been cursed with tunnel vision, it's important to take the steps necessary to break free of it immediately, before you succumb to it completely and remain blind to the truth forever. And breaking free starts with taking things back to basics. Ask yourself why you'd become so dedicated to your chosen strategy. For me, it was simple. The wagon had allowed me to tie everyone up by extending Lenny's lifespan, but what I was only realizing now is that discovering the wagon actually distracted me from something very important. I never determined what the fail conditions were for this mission, something I should have done way back in mission analysis. See, I'd become convinced early on that the wagon was protecting Lenny from taking too much damage, therefore extending the amount of time he had before the enemies would sap him of all his health. But looking at this reasoning in hindsight, I realized that just isn't true, because that's not how this game works. Companions are given enough health so that you'll pretty much never see them die if you're playing normally. The function is there purely to prevent you from playing in a way you aren't supposed to. Whether it's because you're too far away from your companion, you're taking too long to complete the objective, or because the game thinks you aren't engaged in combat enough, every mission has fail conditions. Lenny wasn't dying suddenly because he was taking too much damage. He was dying suddenly because his health was getting set to 1 after I'd triggered the fail condition by doing something the game didn't like. In other words, the wagon wasn't preventing Lenny from taking too many shots. It was lowering the chance that he'd be hit once the fail condition was triggered. Now, this framing was important because it explained why I couldn't get back to tying everyone up without Lenny dying. The fact that I was failing to replicate that attempt was actually normal. Like, it was the logical result. It followed the rules that I had come to understand about this game. Because, bottom line here, the wagon shouldn't have worked, but it did, thanks to one of the worst cases of good luck I have ever experienced. For Lenny to have survived, the wagon must have blocked every single shot from hitting him, meaning his low health per the fail condition was irrelevant. Now, if Lenny hadn't been disarmed and the attempt hadn't failed, this would have been a great thing. I wouldn't have questioned any of this. But because the chances of Lenny never being hit were so low, it happened once and never happened again, which basically set up a template for success that I was very unlikely to ever replicate upon failing. Now, I know that was a lot to throw at you just to basically explain that I'm an easily distracted fool who was using the wrong strategy the entire time, but if there's any lesson a beginner like Lenny needs to learn firsthand, it's this one. Tunnel vision is a dangerous curse. There's no doubt about that. But it's one you place upon yourself. And if I had done my due diligence in the beginning, I wouldn't be back here at square one, re-evaluating all my choices. And I definitely would have made the following progress a lot sooner. Because the key to preventing Lenny's fail condition was very simple. Pretend participation is one of the most common tools you'll see used throughout this series. And if I had tested it first, this portion of the mission would have been over very quickly. As long as I was aiming and throwing my lasso, similar to how I did while trapped in the shack, Lenny would never be reduced to one hit, and as a result, this painfully simple change of direction would soon lead us into some much needed progress. While I had certainly taken the long way around here, my painful crusade to tie up all the enemies was not without its benefits. I'd been exposed to a lot more of this mission than I would have otherwise, and while at first I thought that all of my mistakes had just amounted to a massive waste of time, the extra knowledge I gained would actually soon prove invaluable in a very unexpected way. But first, there was one final obstacle left to clear, and one final lesson for Arthur to teach. The issue with spending so long without progressing at all was that once the time came, I had no fucking clue what was happening. Lenny had taken out about 5 enemies when things shifted entirely. New dialogue played, Lenny completely ditched his usual cover, and almost as a punishment for the mistakes I'd made, I was met face to face with a Western legend. Some say he was born into this world with a bandolier of high caliber ammunition hanging from his belly button as a sick substitute for an umbilical cord. Stories tell of a man so addicted to war that he carts his giant gun around with him no matter where he goes. He's said to be the embodiment of destruction, the pinnacle of pain. But it turns out he was really just some guy, because as soon as I lassoed him, he stopped firing completely. Meanwhile, Lenny continued taking out any enemy that crossed his path. Before long, we weren't dealing with an overwhelming army, but rather a pitiful group of stragglers. Victory actually felt within arm's reach now, and so, feeling more confident than ever, I led those who remained to Lenny's gun. Each one went down in the dirt with a flash, and as night fell, so did the last of Cornwall's men. Well, actually, not the last. It seems that I'd quickly forgotten someone in the heat of battle. Someone who wasn't done with us just yet. See, when I lassoed the Gatling Guy, I noticed he'd stopped firing, but what I missed is that he'd actually become completely frozen. Which was weird. He was just kinda there. Now, I was a little unsure of how to go about this. I knew he either needed to be killed by Lenny or tied up by me, but both options required him to come down from the balcony. I wanted to lasso him down, but of course I didn't want to risk him dying from the fall. So I decided to see if I could get to him myself from the inside. And you know what? I was pleasantly surprised for once. The Gatling Guy basically came running into my arms as soon as I entered the building. It was actually quite wholesome. What wasn't wholesome, however, was what came next. I should have known that a dealer of destruction such as he would not give up so easily. His warm embrace was merely a ruse. We were being fooled. The Gatling Guy still had one last trick up his sleeve. And it was a nasty one. So it turns out I was wrong. The Gatling Guy wasn't just some guy. The legend was at least somewhat true. No matter how long I held him with the lasso, no matter how much ammunition Lenny wasted on him, the legend refused to die. At the time, I really had no idea what was causing his invincibility, but through the power of hindsight, I realized it's actually quite simple. You see, when you play this mission regularly, the Gatling Guy is obviously meant to be executed by the player, triggering one of those small cinematic gamer moments. But because we lassoed him off his gun instead, the game became confused by him still being alive at this point. He was meant to be laying on that balcony with a bullet between his eyes by now, but here he was, very much alive. Too alive, in fact. There was no getting around it. This particular enemy was scripted to be killed by the player, and the player only. But that didn't stop me from looking for alternative ways of getting rid of him instead. I'll be honest with you, things got pretty desperate and deplorable after a while. First, I put him on Frank's back and told him to flee in an attempt to get him to despawn, and when that didn't work, I left him next to the river and surrounded him with predator bait, hoping that an opportunistic alligator might swim by. But regardless of what I tried, the Gatling Guy remained uncompromising. I was tired of this mission. Astounded with the result, yes, but tired nonetheless. It was clear what had to be done here, but I still sat him next to a pile of dynamite for the next half an hour, attempting to get Lenny to shoot it and blow him up. It never happened. The Gatling Guy, much like a crab in search of a new shell, would be free to mosey on through the west, hunting for a new Gatling gun to call home, as soon as he woke up after being KO'd by Arthur. Lenny, sometimes your most powerful tool will be that of a fresh perspective. Often taking a step back and returning with new eyes will show you things you never realized were there all along. Now, I'm not saying you need to step away for over 2 years to achieve this effect, but you know. Now technically, this mission was over, and despite my many mistakes, the boys actually managed to secure a pretty good result. Just one knockout. However, one thing that you should know is just how long ago the attempts you've seen here were recorded. I did my original attempts for this mission on the 14th of March 2021, but my final attempt of this mission was actually recorded not too long ago, and there's a reason for that. Originally, I was going to leave it here, because one knockout was not a bad result, all things considered. But after spending so long away, I knew that a lot of my notes about some of these missions would make no sense to me if I didn't go back in and re-attempt them first. And for this mission, I was particularly eager to do that, because a lot had gone wrong here. Looking back on it, I was really bothered by one thing in particular. By the time I'd wisened up and changed my approach after the wagon fiasco, I was so focused on the fact that we were finally making progress that I didn't realize what the confirmation of Lenny's fail condition had actually made possible. With a way to keep Lenny alive reliably, I had a near infinite amount of time to test any strategy I wanted. Now admittedly, that kind of freedom is a dangerous thing for someone like me, and the strategies I tested to deal with the Gatling Guy went off the rails very quickly. All of them were deeply convoluted, and all of them were fruitless. But it was my prior knowledge of this pretty unusual mission that kept me trying things. So many of this mission's quirks had been revealed to me early on, and everything I experienced there made me want to look deeper. It made me less willing to just accept this knockout when I had a feeling I didn't have to. For now, I'll spare you the details of why I ended up at Emerald Ranch trying to complete a Strauss side mission to get rid of the Gatling Guy, but what I will tell you is that my time there awoke me to something I couldn't believe I hadn't tried. The side mission would only progress if this man was KO'd, and I couldn't tie him up, so ready to just back out and restart the checkpoint, I decided to shoot him. But before I got the chance, upon aiming my weapon, this happened. I didn't know why that happened, I didn't know how, and to be honest, I didn't really care. All that mattered in that moment was the realization that it spawned. Of everything I'd tried against the Gatling Guy, I hadn't once experimented with guns. I hadn't shot in his general direction, I hadn't even aimed at him. My general aversion to using guns at all in this series runs deep, but there have been rare instances where using them has saved more lives than without. And after a few small test runs of the idea that this gave me, I had a strategy that was not only simpler than all the others, but leagues more effective too.
It's good to see you again, despite the circumstances.
Aim on it. We get in front. Out of station. Ah! No. Ah!
Had it with you fools!
Quick! Any men in the area would have heard that. They might be on the way. Now let's grab something and get out.
Sounds like a plan.
And that final, last-minute discovery marked not only the defeat of the Gatling Guy, but also the conclusion of Lenny's second training session. A training session that essentially outlined just about everything that could go wrong. But regardless, Cornwall's planning and organization had been torn to shreds. Shady Belle was no longer a viable outpost for his operations, and Arthur was beginning to think that he may have learned just as much here as Lenny did. Cornwall's armies were growing larger, his tactics more unforgiving. They'd need to stay sharp if they wanted any hope of overcoming his wrath. On their way out, Frank suggested they take Cornwall's dynamite with them, following a sneaking suspicion there'd be a time and place on the horizon for such weaponry. A dark time and place. But that was a worry for another day, and a story for another time.
Arthur, Lenny, coming back.
Hey, I always enjoy riding with you, kid. You know how to fight.
Hey, you too. Anytime, Arthur.